Coffee stained the cuff of her $3,000 blazer. Lillian didn't care. She had 48 hours to produce a fiancé to appease a dying, controlling patriarch, and the only man in her line of sight was the exhausted barista wiping down the espresso machine. "I need a man by Sunday," she demanded. Panic smells like copper and stale mince. Lillian Hayes tasted both at the back of her throat as she stepped out of the private executive elevator. Her heels clicked against the polished granite of the corporate lobby, a sharp, erratic rhythm that echoed the hammering in her chest. She was Lillian Hayes, chief executive of Hayes Logistics. She fired vice presidents before breakfast. She dissolved pensions without blinking. But right now, her hands were shaking so violently she had to curl them into tight, bloodless fists and bury them in the pockets of her tailored wool trousers. Her grandfather, Richard Hayes, was dying. He also held the 20% voting block she needed to stop the board from selling the company to a private equity firm that would gut it for parts. Richard's condition for handing over the proxy. He wanted to meet the grounded, salt-of-the-earth man Lillian had invented over a panicked phone call 3 months ago. "Bring him to the estate on Sunday, Vivi. I want to know you won't end up a miserable, lonely corporate drone like your father before I sign anything." Sunday. It was currently 4:15 p.m. on a Friday. The lobby was mostly empty, swept clean of the mid-level managers who fled exactly at 4. The only sound was the low, mechanical hum of the industrial air conditioning and the hiss of steam from the lobby cafe cart. Lillian stopped. She turned her head. Behind the stainless steel counter of daily grind, a man was violently scrubbing the milk frother. He wore a dark green apron, dusted with flour and splattered with espresso. His shoulders were broad, hunched over the sink, his posture screaming chronic exhaustion. He didn't look up as she approached. She didn't know his name, but she knew his hands. She saw them every morning at 6:30 a.m. when he handed her a black drip coffee without speaking. His knuckles were permanently dry, laced with tiny white scars. "You," Lillian said. Her voice cracked, betraying her. She cleared her throat, squaring her shoulders, pulling the billionaire armor back on. "Hey." "You." The man turned off the tap. He grabbed a grey, damp rag and slowly dried his hands. He looked up. His eyes were the color of wet slate, heavily bagged, underlined by purple shadows of sleep deprivation. He didn't flinch at her tone. He didn't offer a customer service smile. "We're closed, Miss Hayes. Machine's off." He tossed the rag onto the counter. It landed with a wet, heavy slap. "I don't want coffee," Lillian said, stepping closer. The smell of roasted beans, burned sugar, and cheap citrus cleaner filled her lungs. It grounded her slightly. "I have a proposition for you." He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "If this is about the rent increase for the lobby vendors, I already submitted my appeal to HR. I can't afford a 20% hike. Nobody can." "I don't care about your rent," she snapped, the urgency bleeding into her words. She leaned over the counter, invading his space. She noticed a faint smear of pink marker on the collar of his faded grey t-shirt. "I need a man by Sunday, a fiancé, just for 24 hours. I'll pay you $50,000. Silence stretched between them. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder. Lillian expected shock. She expected him to stammer, to eagerly nod, to ask if she was serious while calculating what 50 grand could buy him. Instead, he picked up a bottle of glass cleaner. He sprayed the pastry display case. "No," he said simply. He wiped a streak of grease off the glass. Lillian blinked. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed. "Did you not hear the number? $50,000. All you have to do is put on a suit, drive up to Connecticut with me, and pretend you love me in front of an 80-year-old man." He stopped wiping the glass and looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze moved from the erratic pulse at her throat to her wide, bloodshot eyes, and finally to her clenched jaw. "I heard the number," he said, his voice flat, raspy. "But you smell like panic sweat and dry cleaning chemicals. You look like you haven't slept in 3 days. I have a 6-year-old daughter at home who needs me to make her dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets tonight. I don't have the energy to babysit a billionaire having a nervous breakdown." Lillian recoiled as if he had slapped her. "Babysit? You're a liability right now," he said, tossing the rag into a laundry bin beneath the counter. He untied his apron. "Whatever mess you're in, it's messy enough that 50 grand is pocket change to you, which means the fallout will be spectacular. I don't do fallout. I do coffee, I do kindergarten drop-offs, and I do sleep. Good night, Ms. Hayes." He turned his back on her, grabbing a worn canvas jacket from a hook. "Wait," Lillian breathed out. Her knees felt weak. She wasn't used to hearing the word no. It paralyzed her for a fraction of a second. But then survival instinct kicked in. She reached across the counter and grabbed his forearm. His muscles corded under her grip. He stopped, looking down at her hand. Her manicured nails dug into his skin. His arm was warm, uncomfortably warm against her perpetually cold fingers. "Please." The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated it. She hated him for making her say it. "I will lose my company. My grandfather is going to give the voting rights to my uncle, and he will sell Hayes Logistics by Tuesday. 10,000 people will lose their jobs, including you." The man stared at her hand until she slowly let go, her fingers uncurling. He rubbed his forearm. He looked at the empty lobby, then up at the security camera in the corner, and finally back at Lillian. The defiance in his eyes shifted, settling into a grim, deeply tired resignation. "My name is Arthur," he said quietly, "and we need to talk about my daughter." They didn't go to her corner office. Arthur refused. "If we go up to the 60th floor, we play by your rules," he had muttered. Instead, they sat in the basement-level employee break room. Lillian felt entirely out of place. The room smelled overwhelmingly of microwaved tuna, stale bleach, and burnt popcorn. A flickering fluorescent tube overhead cast a sickly yellow pallor over the cheap faux wood laminate tables. She sat rigidly on a plastic chair that dug into her tailbone, keeping her designer bag clutched tightly in her lap. Arthur sat across from her. He hadn't brought her a coffee, but he had poured himself a cup of lukewarm water from the cooler. He took a slow sip. His hands were large, resting flat on the sticky table. "Here is the reality," Arthur began, his voice devoid of any deference. "I am a single father. My ex-wife left when my daughter, Lily, was 2. She doesn't send checks. She doesn't call. It's just me and the kid. I don't have family to watch her this weekend. So, if I go to Connecticut to play your lapdog, Lily comes with us." Lillian felt a spike of sharp irritation. "Absolutely not. My grandfather is a dying traditionalist snob. He lives in an estate filled with Ming vases and white carpets. You can't bring a child into that environment." "Then find another fake fiancé," Arthur said, pushing his chair back. The plastic legs scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. "Wait." Lillian leaned forward, her chest tight. "I'll hire a nanny, the best agency in the city. They'll stay with her in a 5-star hotel. I'll pay for everything." Arthur stopped. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine anger break through his exhaustion. "You think I'm going to hand my 6-year-old over to a stranger you bought with a black card, just so I can go play pretend with you?" He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could smell the mint toothpaste he'd used hours ago, mingled with the scent of fatigue. "I don't abandon my kid. Not for 50 grand, not for $1 million. She comes, or there's no deal. Tell your grandfather she's from a previous relationship. If he's a traditionalist, tell him you're a loving stepmother. It'll make you look softer." Lillian stared at him. He wasn't blinking. He meant every word. She felt a strange, unsettling twist in her stomach. It wasn't just frustration, it was an unfamiliar respect. The men in her world sold their mothers for a fraction of a percent in stock options. This man was turning down life-changing money because he wouldn't leave his daughter with a babysitter. "Fine." Lillian swallowed hard. "She comes. We tell him I'm helping you raise her." Arthur nodded slowly, easing his chair back to the table. "Good. Now, the money." Lillian reached into her bag, pulling out a slim checkbook. 50,000. As agreed. 80. Arthur counted. Lillian paused, her silver pen hovering over the paper. She looked up, narrowing her eyes. "You're pushing your luck, Arthur. You said 10,000 jobs are on the line. You're a billionaire. 50 was your panic number. 80 is my inconvenience number." He didn't sound greedy. He sounded like a man reading from a grocery list. "I need 30,000 to clear a legal debt from the custody battle. 20,000 to fix the transmission on my truck so I don't have to wake Lily up at 5 a.m. to catch the bus. And 30,000 to put into a high-yield savings account for her college. I don't want a penny for myself to buy toys. I want security." He wasn't negotiating. He was stating facts. Lillian looked at the harsh overhead light reflecting in his dark eyes. She felt a sudden, heavy wave of exhaustion wash over her. It was a bone-deep weariness she usually kept buried under caffeine and adrenaline. Why was she fighting him? He was right. It was a drop in the ocean for her. She clicked the pen and wrote the check. She tore it along the perforation, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet break room. She slid it across the sticky laminate. Arthur looked at it. He didn't snatch it. He carefully folded it in half and put it in his breast pocket. "Okay," he said, exhaling a long breath. The tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction. "What's the story?" "We met 6 months ago," Lillian recited automatically, slipping back into her corporate cadence. "You spilled coffee on me in the lobby. I yelled at you. You didn't back down. I found it refreshing. We started dating secretly to avoid corporate gossip." Arthur let out a harsh, brief laugh. It sounded like a rusty gate swinging shut. "I spilled coffee on a $3,000 suit, and you found it refreshing. Lady, if I spilled coffee on you, you'd have security escort me out and sue me for dry cleaning costs." "It's a romantic comedy trope," she snapped defensively. "My grandfather watches those Hallmark movies. He'll eat it up." "It's garbage," Arthur said smoothly. "We met because you left your phone on the counter. I kept it safe. You came back, panicked. I handed it over. You offered me a reward. I told you to just buy a pastry. You bought a stale blueberry muffin and sat in the corner eating it, looking miserable. I asked if you were okay. You cried. Just a little. Because you're human. Lillian felt her face flush. I don't cry. Everyone cries, Arthur said softly. The sudden gentleness in his voice threw her violently off balance. Especially people who wear armor as thick as yours. We tell him that story. It's grounded. It makes you look like a person, not a spreadsheet. Lillian swallowed. The lump in her throat was back. She looked down at her hands. Fine. The phone. The muffin. We stick to that. What about me? Arthur asked. I'm a barista. Does your grandfather know that? No, Lillian admitted, refusing to meet his eyes. I told him you own a boutique coffee roasting supply chain. Arthur groaned, burying his face in his hands. Of course you did. God forbid you marry the help. It was a panic lie, she defended, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls. He asked what you did, and I couldn't just say you pull shots in my lobby. He's a snob, Arthur. I'm trying to play the game. Arthur lowered his hands. He looked tired again. All right. Boutique roasting supply chain. Whatever. What am I wearing? A tailor is coming to my penthouse tomorrow at 9 a.m., Lillian said, standing up and smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from her trousers. Bring Lily. We need to go over the family tree. My grandfather's estate is heavily staffed. We will be watched from the moment we pull into the driveway. You cannot slip up. Arthur stood. He was taller than her, even in her heels. Up close, the smell of roasted coffee was overpowering. I won't slip up, Lillian. I've got 80,000 reasons not to. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing against hers. The brief point of contact sent a strange jolt of static through her silk blouse. She stood in the break room alone for a long time after he left, listening to the hum of the vending machine, wondering if she had just saved her company or made the biggest mistake of her life. The penthouse was silent. It was always silent. Lillian had paid an exorbitant amount of money for acoustic dampening in the walls to ensure the noise of the city never breached her sanctuary. The floors were poured white concrete. The furniture was sharp, angular, and mostly monochrome. At exactly 9 a.m. on Saturday, the private elevator chimed. Lillian stood by the kitchen island, nursing a mug of black coffee that tasted like hot tar. She wore a simple beige cashmere sweater and silk lounge pants, trying to project a casual ease she didn't feel. The elevator doors slid open. Arthur stepped out. He was wearing a clean pair of jeans and a grey Henley shirt. His hair was damp, pushed back from his forehead, revealing a face that looked slightly less haggard than the day before. But Lillian barely registered him. Her eyes dropped to the small figure holding his hand. Lily was a chaotic explosion of colour in Lillian's sterile monochrome world. She wore bright pink leggings, a tutu skirt sprinkled with glitter, and a t-shirt featuring a cartoon dog. Her messy brown curls were barely contained by a neon yellow headband. On her feet were clunky sneakers that flashed red and blue with every step she took. The child stopped and stared at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. "Whoa," Lily whispered. She looked up at her dad. "Are we in a spaceship?" Arthur smiled. It was a real smile, reaching his eyes and softening the harsh lines around his mouth. Lillian felt a strange pang in her chest. He hadn't looked at her like that. "Just a very tall apartment, Bug," Arthur said. He let go of her hand and looked at Lillian. His smile vanished, replaced by the guarded, business-like expression from yesterday. "We're here." "I see that," Lillian said, stepping forward. She didn't know how to talk to children. She treated her nieces and nephews like foreign dignitaries, offering polite nods from a safe distance. "Hello, Lily." Lily hid behind her father's leg, peering out with one large brown eye. "Hi. You don't have any toys?" No, I don't," Lillian said, feeling inexplicably defensive. "It's okay," Lily said sympathetically. "I brought my coloring book. Can I sit on the white couch?" Lillian's eyes darted to the $10,000 imported Italian linen sofa. "Actually, why don't you sit at the kitchen island? I have some very nice paper." She pulled out a stack of heavy stock, watermarked corporate letterhead and a pen. Lily looked at the pen, unimpressed. Arthur sighed, reaching into his worn backpack and pulling out a battered tin of crayons. He lifted Lily onto a high bar stool. "Stay here, Bug. Color inside the lines." "I won't," she replied cheerfully. The doorbell rang. Lillian flinched. The tailor, Giovanni, had arrived. For the next hour, the penthouse transformed into an uncomfortable staging ground. Giovanni, a fussy, meticulous man who had tailored suits for Lillian's father, fluttered around Arthur with a measuring tape and a mouth full of pins. Arthur stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the guest bedroom, wearing a charcoal grey bespoke suit that Lillian had ordered, rushed from her personal contact. "Hold still, please, signore," Giovanni mumbled, adjusting the drape of the trousers. Arthur looked suffocated. He tugged at the crisp white collar of the dress shirt. "It's too tight. I can't breathe." "It's European cut," Lillian said, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "It's supposed to be fitted. It makes you look powerful." "It makes me look like a corpse in a very expensive casket," Arthur shot back. He rolled his shoulders, grimacing. "And the wool is scratchy." "It's super 150S merino wool. It costs more than your truck." "My truck is comfortable," Arthur muttered. Giovanni moved to adjust the sleeve length, pulling the fabric tight. "Ah, signore. Please, the arm." Arthur shifted, and suddenly a sharp hiss escaped his teeth. He yanked his arm back. "Scusa. Apologies." Giovanni gasped, stepping back. Lillian stood up straight. "What happened?" "Nothing," Arthur said quickly. But Lillian saw the tiny bead of bright red blood blooming on the cuff of the white shirt. Giovanni had pinned him. "You're bleeding," Lillian said, walking over. She grabbed a tissue from a lacquered box on the dresser. "Let me." She stepped into his personal space. The smell of ozone from the air purifier mixed with the warm, clean scent of his soap. She took his wrist. His skin was rough beneath her smooth fingers. She pressed the tissue gently against the tiny puncture wound on his forearm. Arthur went perfectly still. He looked down at her. She was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his slate-grey eyes. "I'm fine," he said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding rougher than usual. "Don't bleed on the shirt," she murmured, keeping her eyes fixed on the tissue. "We don't have time to get another one." She noticed the burn scar on the inside of his wrist, jagged and white. A steam wand burn. She noticed the way his pulse jumped steadily beneath her thumb. He wasn't a mannequin. He was a breathing, exhausted, real man. And suddenly, the reality of what she was asking him to do hit her with the force of a freight train. She was dragging this man into a viper's nest. Her grandfather would dissect him. Her uncle would mock him. She looked up. Their faces were inches apart. "They are going to be cruel to you," she said softly, the corporate mask slipping just a fraction. "My family. They don't speak like normal people. They use words like knives. If they suspect you aren't one of us, they will try to humiliate you." Arthur looked at her. He didn't pull away from her grip. "I've dealt with angry customers screaming at me because there was too much foam in their macchiato, Lillian. Rich people trying to make me feel small is just a Tuesday. I can handle your grandfather." "You don't understand," she insisted, her voice tight. "You have to be convincing. You have to look at me like—" "Like what?" he asked softly. "Like you love me," she whispered. The words felt foreign on her tongue, acidic, terrifying. Arthur stared at her. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with an unspoken, uncomfortable tension. Before he could answer, a loud plastic crash echoed from the kitchen. Lillian jumped back, dropping his wrist as if it had burned her. She spun around and hurried out of the bedroom. Arthur right behind her, pins still sticking out of his half-hemmed trousers. In the kitchen, Lily was standing on the floor, looking horrified. A heavy crystal water pitcher lay shattered on the white concrete floor, a puddle of water seeping toward the Italian leather rug. "I'm sorry," Lily cried, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "I just wanted a drink. I couldn't reach the tap." Lillian froze. The pitcher was a baccarat crystal antique, a gift from her mother. It was worth thousands. The silence in the penthouse was broken only by the child's quiet, terrified sobbing. Arthur pushed past Lillian. He didn't look at the broken glass. He didn't calculate the cost. He dropped to his knees, heedless of the tailored wool trousers, and pulled his daughter into his arms. Hey, Bug, it's okay. Are you cut? Let me see your hands," he murmured, his voice infinitely gentle, checking her small fingers for glass. "It's just a cup. It's just an accident." Lillian stood, paralyzed. She watched the man, the cynical, exhausted barista, hold his weeping child with a fierce, protective tenderness. She looked at the shattered crystal on the floor. It's just a cup. In Lillian's world, nothing was ever just a cup. Everything had a price. Everything was a transaction. But watching Arthur stroke his daughter's hair, soothing her panic over a priceless antique, Lillian realized a terrifying truth. She hadn't just rented a prop for the weekend. She had brought a deeply human, dangerously real variable into her perfectly calculated life, and she had absolutely no idea how to control it. Gravel crunched beneath the heavy tires of the Maybach. It was a sharp, grating sound that chewed at Lillian's nerves. They were rolling up the half-mile driveway of the Hayes estate in Connecticut, flanked by ancient, suffocating oak trees. Inside the cabin, the silence was thick. Lillian sat rigidly on the plush leather, her manicured nails digging half-moons into her own palms. The air conditioning was set to 68 degrees, but a bead of sweat crawled down her spine. Arthur sat across from her, staring out the tinted window. He looked entirely different in the tailored charcoal suit. The cheap grey t-shirts were gone, replaced by crisp white cotton and a silk tie he had loosened the second they got in the car. He looked older, harder, like a man walking to an execution rather than a family dinner. Beside him, Lily was fast asleep, her cheek pressed against his thigh, drooling slightly onto the expensive Super 150S wool. He didn't seem to care. His large hand rested protectively on her back, his thumb rubbing rhythmic circles over her velvet dress. "Wake her up," Lillian said, her voice tight. "We're almost at the gates. The staff will be watching." Arthur slowly turned his head. His slate-grey eyes were flat. "She gets carsick if I wake her up too fast. The staff can wait 3 minutes. Lillian swallowed the urge to snap at him. She was paying him to follow orders, but in the enclosed space of the car, his quiet authority was immovable. The car glided to a halt in front of the sprawling stone mansion. The front doors opened before the engine even cut off. Standing on the limestone steps, looking like a vulture in a cashmere cardigan, was her Uncle Charles. "Showtime," Arthur muttered. He gently shook Lily's shoulder. "Hey, Bug, we're here. Time to see the big house?" Lily blinked, rubbing her eyes. She looked down at the wet spot on Arthur's trousers. "I made a mess." "It dries," Arthur said, unbuckling her. He stepped out of the car first, adjusting his cuffs before turning to offer Lillian a hand. Lillian hesitated. She looked at his palm, calloused, rough, entirely uncorporate. She placed her cold, trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding. For a second, the overwhelming smell of the estate's damp pine needles and old money receded, replaced by the faint, lingering scent of espresso and clean laundry clinging to Arthur's skin. "Breathe," he murmured, so low only she could hear it. "They're just people." "They aren't," Lillian whispered back. "They're sharks." "Lillian!" Charles's voice boomed across the driveway, entirely devoid of warmth. He descended the stairs, his eyes instantly locking onto Arthur. The calculation in Charles's gaze was mechanical, scanning the suit, the posture, the unpolished shoes Arthur had refused to let Giovanni replace. "And you brought the mystery man." "Charles," Lillian said, pasting on her boardroom smile. It felt brittle enough to shatter. "This is Arthur, and his daughter, Lily. Arthur, my uncle." Arthur extended a hand. "Pleasure." Charles looked at the hand for a fraction of a second too long before taking it. "Arthur, the boutique coffee roaster. Lillian told us so little. I was beginning to think you were a tax write-off." Charles chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound. Arthur didn't laugh. He just held the handshake until Charles awkwardly pulled away. "And a child," Charles noted, looking down at Lily as if she were a spill on a rug. "Father didn't mention a child. He's resting in his study. The nurse says he's weak today. We'll be dining in the formal room. Just the adults." He glanced pointedly at Lily. "I'll have the housekeeper set up a tray in the kitchen for the girl." Arthur stiffened. Lillian felt the shift in his posture instantly. A sudden, violent tension radiating from his shoulders. He opened his mouth, and Lillian's heart slammed against her ribs. He was going to blow it. He was going to curse her uncle out and walk down the driveway. Lillian stepped in front of Arthur, her heel clicking sharply on the limestone. "Lily eats with us, Charles," Lillian said. Her voice was ice. Charles blinked, genuinely surprised. "Lillian, the dining room is large enough for 4 people," Lillian interrupted, shocked by her own ferocity. She didn't care about the kids' table. She cared that Arthur looked ready to tear Charles's throat out, and she needed Arthur cooperative. "Set another plate. Now." Dinner was a slow, agonizing suffocation. The dining room smelled of roasted pheasant, heavy red wine, and beeswax polish. The silverware scraped against bone china with excruciating clarity. Richard Hayes, the patriarch, had been wheeled to the head of the table. He was a skeleton, draped in a velvet smoking jacket. A thin, clear tube ran beneath his nose, tethered to a quietly hissing oxygen concentrator. Richard hadn't said a word to Arthur. He just watched him with watery, predatory eyes. Charles, however, was treating Arthur like a chew toy. "So, Arthur," Charles said, swirling his $400 Bordeaux. "Boutique roasting. Fascinating. What's your EBITDA margin on a supply chain like that? With global shipping bottlenecks, the overhead must be bleeding you dry." Lillian froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. This was it. The trap. If Arthur tried to fake corporate jargon, Charles would eviscerate him. Arthur put down his knife. He wiped his mouth with the linen napkin. He didn't look at Lillian. "Margins are garbage," Arthur said bluntly. The table went completely silent. Even the hissing of the oxygen machine seemed to pause. "Excuse me?" Charles asked, an amused smirk playing on his lips. "I said they're garbage," Arthur repeated, leaning back in his chair. He looked exhausted, and suddenly he stopped trying to hide it. Bean rust in Colombia wiped out 20% of the yield this year. Shipping containers tripled in price. You want to talk overhead? Milk costs are up. Rent is a joke. If you're in the coffee business to get rich right now, you're an idiot. Charles's smirk faltered. Then why do you do it? Arthur looked down at Lily, who was busy dissecting a dinner roll with her fingers. Because people need to wake up. They come in tired. They come in stressed about losing their jobs, or fighting with their spouses, or keeping the lights on. For 5 minutes, I hand them something warm that they didn't have to make themselves. It's a basic human transaction. It's not about EBITDA. It's about not letting the city crush people before 9 a.m. He looked back up, his slate eyes locking onto Charles. I don't bleed my business dry, Charles, because my business is keeping people standing. What does your business do? Charles's face flushed a deep, ugly, mottled red. He opened his mouth to snap back, but a harsh, wet sound cut him off. It was Richard. The old man was laughing. It turned into a ragged cough, but he waved off the nurse who stepped forward. A basic human transaction, Richard wheezed, his voice like grinding stones. He pointed a bony finger at Arthur. You don't talk like a CEO, Arthur. You talk like a man who works for a living. I am a man who works for a living, sir, Arthur said, entirely unfazed by the billionaire's gaze. Richard stared at him for a long, heavy moment. Then he turned his head slowly toward Lillian. Bring him to my study. I want a word. Alone, rubbing alcohol and stagnant dust. The scent of the corridor outside Richard's study clung to Lillian's throat like a physical weight. She pressed her spine against the flocked wallpaper, counting the rhythmic hiss-click of her grandfather's oxygen machine bleeding through the heavy mahogany door. Down the hall, Lily was asleep on a priceless Persian rug, a plastic doll tucked beneath her chin. 20 minutes had passed. Lillian's fingernails bit into the meat of her palms, leaving deep crescent moons. If Richard saw through the lie, Hayes Logistics would be butchered by Monday. Severance packages, gutted pensions, a boardroom bloodbath. The mahogany door finally clicked open. Arthur stepped out. He looked entirely hollowed out. His hands went straight to his silk tie, yanking the knot down, popping the top button of the stifling bespoke shirt. He didn't look at her with triumph. He looked at her with a profound, suffocating pity. "What happened?" Lillian hissed, her corporate mask shattering. Panic leaked out into the quiet hallway. "Did he sign it?" Arthur dragged a rough hand over his face. The skin around his eyes was bruised with exhaustion. "He wants you." Lillian pushed past him. The study was a tomb of leather and stagnant heat. Richard Hayes sat slumped behind his massive desk, the proxy documents resting flat under his pale, liver-spotted hands. He didn't look up. "Do you think I'm a senile idiot, Lillian?" Richard's voice was a wet rasp. Lillian froze. The air left her lungs. "He doesn't own a logistics chain," Richard wheezed, tapping a manila folder beside the proxy. "I ran the plates on his truck on Friday. Arthur Pendleton. He makes lattes in your lobby. 30 grand in debt. You bought a barista." Her knees turned to water. She gripped the back of a leather chair just to stay upright. There it was. The end. "I had to," she choked out, stripping away the boardroom excuses. "Charles will strip this company for parts. I was protecting—" "Quiet," Richard snapped. He coughed, a terrible, rattling sound that shook his narrow shoulders. He picked up his gold fountain pen. "I offered him $1 million. Lillian stopped breathing. "I told him to take the money, grab his kid, and leave you to the wolves," Richard continued, uncapping the pen. $1 million in cash. He laughed in my face. Lillian stared. "What?" "He told me to shove it. Said you were a paranoid, ruthless nightmare of a woman." A grim, skeletal smile touched Richard's lips. "But he also said you were the only person in this family who actually gives a damn about the people working under you. Then he fixed the kink in my oxygen line." Richard pressed the gold nib to the paper. The scratching sound was deafening. "You brought a rented peasant into my house, but you bought a man who didn't sell you out when the bid went up. Your instincts are better than Charles's." He signed the line. "Take your company. Get out." Gravel crunched under the Maybach's tires. The drive to Queens was a vacuum of silence. Lily slept across Arthur's lap, her small hand clutching the ruined fabric of his tailored trousers. Arthur stared out the tinted glass at the blur of the highway. He didn't ask for a bonus. He didn't ask for a thank you. He just looked like a man who wanted to go to sleep. At 2:14 a.m., the car idled outside a dingy brick walk-up. The street smelled of wet asphalt and rotting garbage. Arthur carried his daughter out, the cold wind whipping his unbuttoned jacket. Lillian rolled down her window. The city chill bit her cheeks. "Arthur." He paused under a flickering halogen street lamp. $1 million. Lillian's voice cracked. She gripped the leather armrest. "Why didn't you take it?" Arthur shifted Lily higher on his shoulder. He looked back at the $500,000 car, the signed proxy sitting on the leather seat, and the billionaire sitting alone in the dark. "Because his money felt dirty," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of theatrics. "And because you looked terrified in that hallway. I don't abandon terrified people." He turned his back and walked through the cracked glass door of his building. He didn't look back. Lillian sat in the cavernous silence of the back seat. She looked down at the manila folder. She had the company. She had the votes. She had won everything. So why did her chest ache? Why did the air in the Maybach suddenly feel too thin to breathe? The driver put the car in gear, pulling away from the curb. Lillian Hayes was heading back to her perfect, sterile penthouse, entirely victorious, and for the first time in her life, completely destroyed. Lillian secured her empire, but did she just walk away from the only real connection she's ever felt? If this raw, grounded drama kept you hooked until the very end, don't just scroll past. Drop a like, share this video with a friend who loves unexpected romance, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our deep dive stories. What do you think Lillian's next move should be? Will she return to the lobby cafe? Comment below.